What if there was a memory before all memories, an echo lost in the time that do you insist on whispering, that we were not the first great civilization in this world? Sometimes, one only has to observe the silence among the ruins to realize that there are questions that cannot be asked. They have disappeared. They are just waiting for the courage to be done. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is what you needed to hear. Imagine for a moment that every ancient stone recorded in history not only counts what was, but also what someone tried to hide. The past left marks deep, but not all of them remained on the surface. Some are buried so deep that they can only be perceived when the soul becomes still enough to listen. It's as if humanity walked on the rubble of something much bigger, something that existed before of the Great Flood, before the first written tablets, before the official narratives that shaped what we call history. There are ancient people who talk about masters who came from before, cities that shone, knowledge that did not belong to his time. And when these reports are repeated in places as far away as Mesopotamia, South America, and the coast of Mediterranean, it is difficult to believe in mere collective imagination. Maybe what we call myth is just the distorted memory of a civilization that saw the world erased by a greater force, and then, being reborn among the wreckage, tried to tell what was left through symbols, stones, and dreams. Modern science, despite its rigor, already admits that there are deep gaps between periods of human history, leaps of knowledge that emerge abruptly, structures so old that they defy the tools attributed to the times in which they were supposedly built, as if someone had left clues, but only for those who dared to look without fear. So breathe. Allow yourself to go through this portal slowly, because when we seek understanding what came before the flood, we are not just investigating ruins, we are touching the memory of the earth itself. And the real question is, are we ready to hear what she's still trying to tell us? There is a detail that almost no one notices when talking about ancient civilizations. The human memory is not just what we can record, is also what we try to forget. And when we observe the reports of cultures spread across the planet, something begins to repeat itself with uncomfortable precision. People who never found, who lived separated by oceans and millennia, narrate the existence of a previous time, a luminous period that ended in water, fire, or darkness. This convergence does not arise by chance. It works like a kind of ancestral code, indicating that perhaps our history is not a straight line, but a circle where knowledge appears, disappears, and sometimes reemerges as fragments of a collective dream. This is where science stumbles over its own limits. Excavations point to structures older than any accepted traditional annual. These are precisely cut rock surgical, astronomical alignments impossible for societies considered primitive, and erosion marks that indicate ages much higher than the chronology's officers. When we look at megalithic sites around the world, we realize that easy answers no longer work. If humanity actually started from scratch after the flood, how to explain such complex knowledge, appearing so early, in such a sudden? Science recognizes the anomaly, but avoids following the trail, where it actually occurs. Points. And emotionally, there is something about this that moves us deeply. Because if there was a technological civilization before the flood, it is not just archaeological data lost in the time. She is a memory that vibrates in the invisible walls of the human soul. Maybe because this means that so many people feel that they have already seen places they have never been, that they know things they have never studied, that connect spiritually with much more older than history allows. It is as if every fragment of these ancient people awakens something within us, a subtle memory, almost a spiritual déjà vu, asking to be recognized. When we confront this evidence, the inevitable contrast emerges. On the one hand, what taught us? That we are the apex of evolution, that before us there were only societies, simple and rudimentary. On the other, artifacts, calculations, astronomical orientations, and architecture that seems to have been conceived by mature, precise visionary minds that supposedly should not have existed in that period. This divergence creates the abyss, and in this abyss, the silence of the ancients speaks louder than any professor of history. But perhaps the most perplexing point is the universal pattern that runs through it all. Whenever a culture talks about a global cataclysm, it associates that event with return of something greater. A cycle, a purification, a restart. If so many societies narrate the same disaster and the same reconstruction, it would not be logical to consider that were they, in fact, reconstructing something that had already existed, a lost technology, an advanced form of knowledge, perhaps even a symbolic language capable of uniting science and spirituality in a way that today seems impossible to us. And here the synthesis emerges. We are not just looking for ruins. We seek the meaning of our own trajectory. The mystery of pre-flood civilizations is not just archaeological. It is emotional. It is psychological. It is spiritual. It forces us to reevaluate who we are, where we come from, we came. And why does Earth keep these stories like someone protecting a secret destined at the right time? If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here. But the real question is still open. Whether there was such an advanced civilization, why that she disappeared so completely. When we look at the remains of the past with really attentive eyes, we realize something that is rarely said out loud. Certain structures spread across the planet seem carry an intelligence that does not match the tools attributed to the times in which that were supposedly built. We are not just talking about large blocks of stone or occasional alignment with some celestial phenomenon. We are talking about millimeter precision, cuts that defy conventional explanations and guidelines, astronomical measurements, so exact that they would only be possible with complex calculations. It's as if the ancients had access to a type of knowledge, or technology, that simply does not fit into the linear narrative of human evolution. And this feeling of disagreement does not. It is a romantic speculation, is a fact that vibrates when we compare pieces that have never been should have existed at that time. When we analyze this evidence with a more scientific eye, questions arise that bother even the most cautious researchers. If populations considered primitive did not have sophisticated machines, advanced measuring instruments, or volumetric engineering, how they managed to accomplish feats that, even today, would require modern tools and highly specialized professionals. The difference between presumed capacity and observed results is so great that it appears to indicate the presence of a lost technological heritage, something transmitted before the flood, and which survived just as a fragment, as an echo. Instead of imagining the ancients as beings, rudimentary, perhaps we should consider that they were heirs of a more complex, bearers of knowledge that escaped global collapse. This reflection touches us deeply because it changes the way we were taught to think about ourselves. The idea that an advanced civilization existed before all known narratives awaken a strange sensation of recognition in us. It's like if something inside us said, "This makes sense," as if we were rescuing something that we do not learn, but that we remember. There is a kind of silent ancestry that manifests itself when we see these impossible works. They awaken memories that are not individual, but collective, memories that seem to record a time when humanity and knowledge walked hand in hand in a more integrated way, almost spiritual. And this internal recognition, this familiarity, indicates that part of our identity is perhaps deeply linked to this forgotten period. The contrast between this view and what official history accepts creates an inevitable clash. From on the one hand, academia insists on strict chronologies and linear progressions. On the other, the material evidence tells something very different. It tells about jumps, interruptions, sudden beginnings, and apparent cultural resets. When we see cities emerging mature, architectural styles appearing ready, and complex symbolic systems emerging from nowhere, we realize that something doesn't fit. It seems that certain people do not learned, but remembered. This difference is profound. It points to the possibility that the flood not only destroyed a world, but interrupted a technological and spiritual continuity that, on a smaller scale, tried to rebuild itself in later civilizations. And then we come to the emotional synthesis that this mystery provokes. Investigating a technological civilization before the flood is not just about seeking external explanations, is touch a kind of inner longing. Perhaps this universal fascination with ancient mysteries born from the feeling that we are trying to recover our own origin. How if each discovery was a lost piece of what we once were, or what we could return to be? The earth holds memories, and the human soul seems to feel when something in those memories belong to us. Even without absolute proof, there is a resonance that insists on remain, an invisible link between now and that which preceded the great oblivion. But Sue, the question that opens the next portal then arises, whether remnants of this technology reached us, where exactly the clearest evidence lies, and why so many appear to have been deliberately hidden. As we begin to piece together the scattered pieces of this enigma, we realize that some evidence is not just forgotten, it appears carefully hidden. All around the world, entire archaeological centers maintain inaccessible areas, sealed tunnels, closed chambers, and inexplicable structures that remain out of public view. Officially, we talk about preservation, risk of collapse, lack of resources, or protection cultural. But when we repeat this pattern in different countries, times, and institutions, there is a feeling that the story is being filtered. And sometimes the unrevealed parts are precisely those that would point to a civilization before the flood. It's as if someone, at some point, had decided that certain responses were too dangerous to be shared. Interpreting this dynamic in depth leads us to question not only what was buried, but why. Science knows the fragility of the official narrative. You know that all it takes is a few out-of-place finds, an unexpected dating, a very complex, technologically advanced object. So the entire chronology needs to be rewritten, and rewriting history is not a neutral process. Change identities, tear down traditions, undo certainties, and demand a return to the origins that many fear. So, when we find blocked chambers, tunnels never explored, or artifacts collected without disclosure, we realize that it's not just the past that's at stake. It's the pride of centuries of interpretations. The truth may be hidden not because it is unlikely, but because it is so transformative. This revelation generates in us a mixture of restlessness and curiosity. The feeling that there is something greater, something that we have been prevented from knowing. It provokes us emotionally. Why does this matter so much? Because somehow, the human soul senses that our story is deeper than what the books say. Do you feel that we carry an interrupted legacy, a legacy we do not fully understand? When we imagine that ancient people may have inherited fragments of a technology of before the flood, perhaps sustainable energy, advanced construction methods, accurate astronomical knowledge, something aligns internally. Not because we believe in mystery, but because the material world cannot explain everything that we feel, know, or remember intuitively. The contrast between what is explicit and what is hidden becomes evident when we look at archaeological sites where the narrative seems too tight. In some places, structures that defy explanation are simply classified as ceremonial, even when there is no ritual evidence. In others, gigantic blocks are attributed to rudimentary tools without any plausible demonstration of how that would have been possible. Sometimes the explanation is so flimsy that it seems to secretly ask to be questioned, and it is in these flaws, in these contradictions, that we realize that the past is not being told, it is being interpreted, and interpretations can carry fears, limits, and agendas. The emotional synthesis of it all is powerful. The missing pieces of our story perhaps are not lost, they are just not being shown. And when we look at the world with this perspective, we realize that the question is not whether there was a civilization advanced before the flood. The question is, how much of it still remains hidden beneath seals, locks, and speeches that try to preserve a comfortable version of reality? If we begin to open these doors, what we find may not only broaden our understanding of the past, but reconfigure our vision of the future. And then the next portal appears. If this civilization really existed, where are the traces, most visible aspects of their technology? And why some of these traits seem to survive even today, silently, in structures that still defy the impossible? When we look in depth at the structures that have survived time, we realize that some seem to carry marks of knowledge that transcends known reality. They are buildings so old that they defy any logical chronology, so precise that they call into question even what we call engineering today advanced. Some of these works seem not only to be buildings but also to be testimonies, silent sounds of a technology that predated the flood, and that was perhaps designed to last precisely because its creators knew that the world would go through a collapse inevitable. It's as if every block, every alignment, every angle to the millimeter calculated to be a message left for the future. We existed. We knew. And what is impressive is that, when we look carefully, We understand that these brands are not belong to an immature people, but to a civilization that dominated forces that today only we begin to understand. When we analyze these buildings with a scientific lens, a series of anomalies emerges, as if it were a pattern repeated in different parts of the world. Many of these structures feature cuts that, to be replicated today, would require Saw's diamonds, industrial lasers, or CNC machines. Still, they are attributed to stone and copper tools, as if historical logic were more important than physical evidence itself. In certain archaeological sites, we find blocks fitted together with such precision that not even a thin metal blade can pass between them, despite having been positioned thousands of years before the emergence of writing. These discrepancies do not speak of mere manual skill. They talk about technical knowledge, speak of lost methods. They speak of an intelligence that calculated weight, vibration, geometry dynamics, and material resonance with a domain that simply does not fit into the official narrative. This perception causes a deep emotional impact on us, as if we were, in a way, rediscovering a forgotten part of humanity. It's hard to look at these ruins and not feel an inner call, a kind of intuition that whispers that this is not new. Perhaps the universal fascination with pyramids, monoliths, and megalithic temples don't just be curious. Maybe it's recognition. Maybe it's ancestral memory. In places, the sensation is almost mystical, as if the earth itself were trying to tell something through these works. It's as if we are facing portals that we cannot. They only resisted time, but they resisted oblivion. And each of them seems say, there was something before, and you can still remember. The contrast between this perception and the traditional historical view creates a conflict that does not we manage to ignore. Because on the one hand, academia invites us to accept explanations simplified, where colossal achievements are attributed to newly organized peoples without instruments, without calculations, and without technical records. On the other hand, we have stones weighing hundreds of tons, transported over long distances, lifted with precision, and positioned as if they were parts of a larger mechanism. The discrepancy is so big that as we observe more evidence, it becomes impossible not to question the dominant discourse. Perhaps the question we need to ask is not, how did they achieve it, but how did we forget? And then the synthesis emerges. These structures are not just constructions, but memories petrified from an era in which technology and spirituality went hand in hand. No, they were simply decorative temples, but energy centers, celestial observatories, knowledge hubs, and points of alignment with phenomena that we are still seeking understand. It is possible that they were created by a society that understood that everything vibrates, that everything resonates, that matter responds to consciousness, and that this science deep was as natural as the air they breathed. But the big question now opens like a portal, whether these monuments carry fragments of a lost technology, where there is direct evidence of its more advanced knowledge, and what exactly they tried to leave for us before that the Great Flood erased almost everything. When we follow the clues left by these forgotten civilizations, we begin to realize that the knowledge they possessed was not just limited to engineering and architecture. There is evidence that they manipulated concepts that today we would call energy, vibration, magnetism, and even electromagnetic resonance, not like abstract theories, but as a practical part of your daily life. In different cultures, we found acoustic chambers so perfect that they transform sound into waves capable of modifying emotional states, structures capable of amplifying vibrations, rocks deliberately magnetized, and alignments that appear to interact with phenomena, solar and lunar images with almost modern precision. This suggests that those who lived before the flood, they had a deep understanding of the energy of the earth, the sky, and the human consciousness itself. They were not mere observers of the cosmos, were participants, assets of a science that united spirit and matter in a harmonious way. Modern science, in examining these structures, finds patterns that challenge simplistic explanations. In some of them, such as deep chambers or tunnels perfectly polished, the absence of soot raises questions about the methods of lighting used by the ancients. In others, there are marks that resemble high-speed rotary tools, incompatible with bronze and copper. There are still giant blocks, aligned with the planetary grid, as if their builders understood energetic fields that today we try to decipher only with instruments advanced. These signs point to an understanding that went far beyond the simple survival. They speak of a civilization that studied the universe as if listening to a symphony, noticing rhythms, patterns, cycles, and vibrations that connected everything. The science may hesitate to admit, but many of these discoveries no longer fit within the traditional narrative. On an emotional level, these revelations awaken something deep within us, the feeling of that we are not discovering something new, but rediscovering something old. It's as if the soul recognized these patterns, as if he had already walked these corridors, touched these walls, feeling this vibration. This inexplicable familiarity, this inner echo, suggests that very old memories still live within us. Perhaps at some point in the history, or prehistory, we already understand that energy, sound, and intention are interconnected, and perhaps by rediscovering these civilizations, we are just reactivating a dormant part of human consciousness, like an ancient flame rekindling slowly. The contrast arises when we realize the abyss between this ancestral knowledge and the way we live today. Modern science has fragmented knowledge into isolated areas, astronomy on one side, physics on the other, spirituality in another box, as if they were incompatible worlds. But the ancients seemed to think differently. For them, everything was the same dance. The sky influenced the earth, vibration shaped matter, thought it created form, and architecture was built to amplify these principles. What we call technology may have been, for them, a natural expression of their own consciousness. This integrated vision, lost over time, shows us how much we move away from this balance. And perhaps that's why, when we observe his works, we feel an inexplicable longing, as if we were looking into a mirror that reflects not the past but what we could have been. And then we come to the synthesis. We are not just faced with sophisticated ruins, but of knowledge that was hidden, interrupted or buried by the cataclysm that marked the end of that era. And if these civilizations dominated energies that today only we intuit, it is possible that some clues to this domain are still hidden, not only in stones, but in texts, symbols, and maps that survived the flood as seeds of a greater memory. Now the inevitable question opens before us. If these seeds still exist, where are the last direct traces of this civilization? And have some survived to survive, transmit in secret what the world almost lost forever? When we follow the thread of this ancestral memory to its deepest limits, we begin to find something even more surprising. Traces that have not disappeared completely after the flood. In different regions of the planet, there are reports of people who emerge, suddenly, already possessing advanced knowledge, as if they were survivors of an earlier era. They appear in the archaeological record without a transition period, without a gradual learning process, as if they were returning to the world something they already knew. Cultures such as the Sumerians, the archaic Egyptians, the inhabitants of Tiahuanaco, and the people of ancient India appear to have inherited information that came from somewhere much older than their own stories tell. It's as if small groups had emerged after the cataclysm, bringing with them fragments of a hastily preserved knowledge, memories of a civilization that knew that time would be cruel to them. When we analyze this hypothesis from the perspective of science, we find coincidences too much to ignore. How to explain that people separated by thousands of kilometers began their civilizations by mastering advanced mathematics, precise astronomy, and absolutely extraordinary building technologies? To this day, experts ask how certain societies that supposedly lived in a rudimentary way were capable of recording planetary orbits, dividing time with atomic precision, and erecting works that challenge even modern machines. This abrupt jump in the time suggests that this is not just about cultural evolution, it's about transmission. Maybe a transmission that is fragmented, incomplete, but still powerful enough to lay the pillars of the first great post-flood civilizations. And when we look at this with an open heart, something profoundly human happens. The intuition arises that these cultures were not starting, they were starting over. A sensation is that they carried in their spiritual memory pieces of a story that they could not physically preserve, just like someone who survives a tragedy and tries to reconstruct, using only what he remembers. These societies seemed guided by a wisdom that was not new, but reconquered, and it is precisely this feeling of reconstruction that often awakens in us, a feeling of familiarity with these peoples, Perhaps we recognize in them the same search that we feel today, the attempt to remember what we were before everything was erased. The contrast with the official historical account is inevitable. The academic narrative asks us to believe that all these people started from scratch, evolving slowly, step by step. But the earth itself says something else. Ruins appear mature, knowledge arises ready, complex languages emerge without an intermediate stage. It's as if part of humanity had taken a shortcut, not because it advanced too quickly, but because I was reconstructing from old memories, from fragments rescued from the flood that almost wiped out everything. When we see this, we realize that the straight lines of history is, in fact, gentle curves, spirals that rise, fall, and return to the point where something essential needs to be remembered. This emotional synthesis leads us to the understanding that perhaps the true inheritance of these pre-flood civilizations is not just in stone, star maps, and mathematical systems. Maybe it's within us. Perhaps humanity carries, at most depth of consciousness, traces of knowledge that was never lost completely, just fell asleep. Every intuition, every spiritual déjà vu, every sensation that we've seen this before, may be a whisper of that primordial memory that insists on return. And then the question arises that leads us to the end of our journey. If all this are fragments of a greater truth, what is the message that this ancient civilization tried to leave it to us, and why it seems that it can only be understood now, when the world again approaches a critical point in its own history? Perhaps, after all, the true revelation is not in the stones, in the calculations, or in the ruins that we analyzed. Perhaps it is in the silent echo that each of these pieces of evidence awakens within us, because when we unite all the fragments, the monuments impossible, the precise calendars, the surviving traditions, and the legends that insist on talking about a world before the flood, something begins to emerge like an ancient mist rising from the heart of the earth. It's not just the history of a civilization forgotten that we try to find again. It's the story of who we are when all layers of oblivion come undone. It's as if we are remembering, little by little, of a pact we made with time, that of finding our origins when we were ready. And emotionally, there is a deep serenity in this realization, the feeling that the past is not dead. It breathes on us silently, waiting for us to look at it with the depth it always deserved. Perhaps this ancient civilization did not have disappeared completely. Perhaps it survived in the form of symbols, intuitions, dreams, and inner calls that we feel without knowing how to explain. Like spiritual seeds planted before the cataclysm, destined to germinate only when humanity reached maturity enough to listen again. And now, in this moment of our story, we begin to hear these whispers. We begin to realize that nothing was by chance. Everything was part of a larger cycle, where memory and oblivion walk side by side until the human heart is ready to remember. If this journey touched something in you, if any part of what was said sparked a fire old, sign up and follow us. Sometimes the soul recognizes paths even before let the mind understand its directions. And perhaps this is the final message left by those who lived before the Great Flood. True knowledge never dies. It just collects itself in the folds of time, waiting for the moment when I can return to the light. What if what we call the end is just the return of a memory that humanity has not yet dared to accept?